Douglas knows Scottish politics very well. He's been a parliamentary researcher in Holyrood, a councillor, an MSP, an MP, a UK government minister, and now, as he fights this next election, he's fighting to be an MSP again. But it's a big ask. The polls show that the SNP are still quite significantly ahead, despite the Sturgeon-Salmond affair. So, other than the kind of mission for the Tories to stop independence and the referendum that Nicola Sturgeon said that she'll be pushing, what else can the Scottish Conservatives do for Scots? What's the vision beyond keeping Scotland in the Union? So I'll start by asking Douglas about the budget, which happened this week. You've been broadly supportive of it, and I think you suggested that it shows why it's important for Scotland to remain in the UK. But does that imply that Scotland is rather dependent on Westminster to subsidise it?
I think what we saw from the budget, and the Chancellor was absolutely right, the majority of announcements he made in the budget were UK-wide. The extension of the furlough scheme, the extension of the self-employed income support scheme, the widening of the eligibility for the self-employed income support scheme, further support for businesses. That affects businesses in Scotland, Wales, England and Northern Ireland. We know 930,000 jobs have been protected, and a huge amount of money has gone in to the businesses during this pandemic. And the budget also delivered another £1.2 billion of additional money for the Scottish Government to spend. There was an acceleration of growth deals in Falkirk, Argyll and Bute and Ayrshire. There was a freeze on whisky duty, and we might speak more about whisky after yesterday's excellent announcement. But that's really important for an iconic Scottish brand, really important here in Murray, where I'm speaking from, where we've got more distilleries than any other part of Scotland. There was investment for the North East and Aberdeen in green technology. So it really was a budget that delivered for the whole of the United Kingdom, and Scotland certainly did well out of the budget.
All very positive, but there's tax rises in there. You're a Conservative, you want low taxes. Do you worry about the increases in income tax and corporation tax?
Well, I am a low tax Conservative, as I think most of my colleagues are, but we have never dealt with a global pandemic of this scale, and the taxpayers have been supporting everyone else during this period in terms of how the government have protected jobs and businesses. So I think it's right that the Chancellor was honest and upfront with people that the support we've seen over the last 12 months it has to be repaid at some point. But I think also the reaction from industries and particular sectors, hospitality and tourism, again, really welcomed the further extension of the reduction in VAT to 5%. So there was a lot in the immediate term that can be welcomed, but we've got to understand that we do have to pay this back at some point.
Margaret Thatcher famously said that one of her greatest victories was Tony Blair. Now, a lot of people have said the level of spending and borrowing that we're seeing is a victory for Corbyn. The Conservative Party's turned into a high spending, high tax party. Do you take that? Do you see that the kind of shift in political and public debate is in a more leftward direction?
Well, it's responding to a global pandemic and our economy being shut down for most of the last year. We've seen governments around the world having to respond, but the way, the speed and the generosity in terms of the furlough scheme and many other support schemes, it has been one of the best anywhere in Europe or indeed around the world. So I think what we've seen is a government that responds to the emergency that we're facing at the moment. And I think it's really important that the support doesn't just stop in a cliff edge, that when we get through the health emergency, we suddenly think that you can just flick a switch and businesses can get back up and running. So what the Chancellor has also outlined is that support, it has to continue in the short to medium term, because businesses are going to take some time to get back up to normal, and that the public will take some time to get back to their normal habits as well. So yes, it's not a traditional approach that you would expect from a Conservative government, but it is one that has adapted to the challenging conditions that it's faced over the last 12 months, which no one could have predicted.
You mentioned avoiding cliff edges. So in 6 months' time, just over 6 months' time, people on universal credit will see a fall in that uplift of 20 quid a week. Now, you've welcomed the extension of 6 months, But do you worry about that cliff edge? I mean, Bright Blue work around Scotland, we've looked at Scottish public attitudes towards poverty. Lots of Scots say there's too much poverty and benefits aren't generous enough. Do you feel that actually you see the uplift should have been extended beyond 6 months?
Well, I think it's right that it was extended in this budget. It was put in place because people were really struggling, again, during this global pandemic that no one could have predicted or could have seen the effects of. And we're still in the middle of that. So it would have been totally wrong for that to have stopped as we continue to fight this health emergency and people are still living with some of the most severe restrictions that we've seen. And we've got to see what happens over the next 6 months. It's been uplifted for that period. And I'm glad that the Chancellor listened and responded to the significant calls on Conservative benches to see that extended through this period. But let's see where we are at the end of the next 6 months.
Is there anything that you're disappointed about from the budget? Were there things that you were calling for which the Chancellor hasn't adopted?
Yeah, I mean, I backed the Scotch Whisky Association's bid for actually not just a freeze in spirits duty, but a reduction in spirits duty, mainly this year because of the huge impact of the punitive tariffs that we saw applied to Scotch whisky and other UK products. Now, on the day of the budget, I took a freeze, as everyone in the industry did, as welcome, but I didn't think less than 24 hours later we'd have even greater news for that sector and Kashmir with the suspension of those tariffs for 4 months, and hopefully we can see them removed altogether. So, yep, there was things I'd called for. I'm not one of these that just says, I only ask for things I think I'm going to get. I put in a strong case for a number of sectors that are important to Scotland, and we got a lot of them, but there's further work to do, and I'll continue to champion these causes. But on whisky, the good news could have been greater with a reduction, but it got even better when we suddenly heard that these tariffs have now been suspended for 4 months.
So later this year, Scotland is obviously going to be at the heart of global action on climate change. Glasgow is hosting COP26. Now, there has been a lot of criticism, including from Bright Blue, that the budget was rather lacklustre on the green agenda. There wasn't really much on helping people heat their homes in a way which reduces the carbon footprint, but also on the way that people drive their cars. So fuel duty has been frozen yet again. It's quite interesting, that term of freezing, because it is actually not maintaining the value of fuel duty in terms of the kind of burden on motorists, but cutting it. It's a tax cut for motorists, people who drive diesel and petrol cars. Why is a tax cut being given to them and not a tax cut to help people on modest incomes elsewhere? Why just motorists?
Well, I support that, and I mentioned this in my speech in the budget debate on Tuesday. I represent a very remote and rural constituency in many parts of Scotland. A car is not a luxury, it's a necessity. People need their own car to stay connected, to move around the area, and to put on further taxes on fuel, I think would have been completely wrong. I know it was a proposal that the SNP have put forward, and I can only imagine how that will go down in many parts of Scotland where people will be aghast to think that the SNP are supporting a hike in their fuel duty. But I support it because, as I say, it's a necessity, not a luxury, for people to be able to travel around the country as affordable as possible. But sorry, I should also say, because you mentioned about green investment, we saw £27 million going into the North East for further investment into the green agenda here, as we see a transition within the oil and gas sector, and there's lots of exciting opportunities coming up in Aberdeen and the surrounding areas to really promote the green agenda as well. So certainly from a Scotland perspective, there was investment to green energy, to renewables, and to that sector.
So are the Scots Tories excited about COP26? What's the sort of plans to be involved in it, and what do you hope the UK can announce there?
Absolutely. I think it's just so encouraging that the United Kingdom got the conference to this country, and that Glasgow is hosting it. It will be the biggest conference ever hosted in the United Kingdom. But I've also been very clear, and I've spoken about this a number of times, it can't just be 11 days in November when we focus on the climate emergency, on our future policies, etc. This has to be a lasting legacy from COP26 in the run-up to November and beyond, that we can see a real tangible difference created because of decisions made at COP26, and really showcase what Scotland has to offer in terms of renewables, in terms of our ambition to get to net zero, in terms of everything we can showcase, large and small, here in Scotland, from development, what we're doing right across Scotland, not just in Glasgow, to really harness and promote everything that's so positive about our green agenda here in this country.
Okay, I'm gonna go on to education policy now, and it's National Apprenticeship Week, and I know that you've been quite vocal on that. What I find interesting about the differences, say, between English and Scottish education is, if you look at the PISA International League table, Scotland always performs worse than England on reading, maths, writing. And then there's quite a radical difference, isn't there, on the university system? The fees that England charge obviously much higher than Scotland, and there is no cap on the number of places to go to English universities where there is in Scotland. And that does seem to have meant that the number of deprived kids in Scotland going to university is lower than the proportion in England. So big differences there. How can you improve the education system in Scotland? What's the kind of big Douglas Ross vision? Hopefully you're not escaping as I...
No, I was pulling the plug out the heater, which is very noisy, and I was telling you just before we came on air, it's a frosty morning in Murray, and the heater kicked in there, but it's too noisy to keep it going while I'm doing a call like this. So just generally, I think I just caught the end of the question there about education. And this is crucial. Nicola Sturgeon told us when she became First Minister in 2014 to judge her on her record, on her #1 priority, which she told us it would be education. And I think anyone looking at how the SNP have handled education in her term as First Minister and their entire 14 years in office would have to give them an extremely poor report card, because we've seen Scotland's reputation in international rankings plummet over that period. We were once a world leader, renowned around the globe for our educational standards, and that suffered. It suffered because the SNP have overseen the biggest reduction in teachers in Scotland. That affects subject choice that young people can expect at schools. So there's an awful lot we need to do to invest in our schools, in our education system, and I've set a number of policies out already. We want to recruit 3,000 additional teachers in the next Parliament. We want to ensure that the buildings our pupils are taught in are of a decent standard. There's far too many pupils taught and teachers teaching in schools that are rated as a condition of poor or bad. We want to introduce a national tutoring scheme, so those who have the ability can get extra tuition, not simply if their parents or guardians can afford it, but because they have that ability. So there are a lot of plans we have already in place for education. But as you say, it's also Scottish Apprenticeship Week this week. And I want to do more to encourage people that there's no wrong turn. Some people, it's absolutely right that they go to university, others to college, others to take up apprenticeships or to go straight into work. So I really want to move on this debate that somehow you're a success if you go to university and you could have done better if you leave school and go straight into work, an apprenticeship or college. I went to college and I thought it was some of the best years I had in my life. And I think it's right for some, university is right for others. So we've got to really break down some of the stigmas that still exist in terms of what young people do when they leave school.
So this sounds a little bit like what Gavin Williamson was saying last summer, which was, scrapping the target of 50% of people going to higher education. So is your argument that too many people go to university and more people should be doing, say, apprenticeships than going to university?
Yes, I think, we have to have that mix, and setting an arbitrary target to try and achieve simply to say X% of the population have gone to university. We've got to look at what they do beyond that. I use a personal example. I'm a twin. My twin sister went to university because she trained to be an accountant, and that was exactly the right choice for her. I went to agricultural college because I was interested in farming, and that was my career before I entered politics. But I shouldn't have been steer to go and study agriculture at university when I could get just as good an education at the Scottish Agricultural College at Auchincruive in Ayrshire. So I really think we should look more at what is right for every young person, and also what are the outcomes after their education. How many people go to university but actually find they can't get the job they want, despite a university qualification that they may have got having gone to college, got an apprenticeship, or going straight into work.
So some of the things you mentioned about improving education in Scotland, whether it's a better deal for teachers, more apprenticeships, more tutoring, it does sound rather familiar. It's been done before, and I wonder whether actually, if Scotland's really going to catch up with England, it needs to replicate much more of the English education system, a compulsory curriculum, making sure there's kind of greater academisation, higher tuition fees. Is it not best to just kind of replicate what clearly is working better in England and adopt it in Scotland?
No, I don't think we have to take everything from England and say that is the right model in Scotland. And you say a lot of what I've already outlined sounds familiar. Well, sadly, it's not familiar after 14 years of failure from the SNP here in Scotland, or I wouldn't be calling for 3,000 additional teachers if they had held on to the teachers we've had in Scotland these last few years. There is a need for more investment in education in our schools, because they've been let down by this Scottish government, who, again, I say, told us to judge them on the record on education, and the record on education is appalling.
Okay, we're going to talk about the SNP a little bit, because obviously they've been very much in the news at the moment. I should remind people, if you are watching, that we are tweeting this, and if you want to comment, please use the hashtag #BrightBlue. But also, we'll go on to questions after I've done this interview stage, and you can ask questions through Slido. The link is on the YouTube page that you're watching, and you just ask it through that. The code, if it asks you for a code, is also #BrightBlue. So, Douglas, the personal matters in politics, and I know you've got a little boy, and has fatherhood changed your politics? And tell us how, if it has.
Yeah, it has. I look at him. I was down in London this week for the first time since December because of the budget, and I wanted to be there for that. And it's the first time in a number of months I've been away for 2 or 3 nights. And I saw him just before he went into nursery today, and it just reminded me in that short period how much I've missed him. We've been communicating over FaceTime. My mum and dad, who had to look after him because my wife's still working, a couple of times this week have been sending endless videos, but it doesn't make up for not being here. But seeing him and just looking at the opportunities he's got, I just want him to have the same opportunities I did. We live here in Moray, about a mile at the most from the primary school I went to, so he'll go to the same school as I did all those years ago, and I want him to have a great education at Avis and at Forest Academy, and have the opportunities to really excel in life, and I want that for every young person. So yeah, it's made me focus particularly on the next generation, and what we can do to improve things in Scotland now to make it better for the generation coming behind us.
And personality matters too, and I think a lot of people think Scottish Conservatives, they did particularly well under Ruth Davidson, who was a very different type of Tory. And frankly, you're not hugely a different type of Tory. So what's the personality of Douglas Ross which will really capture the minds and hearts of Scottish people?
Well, I take that characterisation. I don't know what I'm not so different about from other Tories. One, I'm glad that Ruth came back to frontline politics when I became leader to challenge Nicola Sturgeon at First Minister's questions up until the election. And I think we've seen quite clearly that the forensic questioning that Ruth has done in Holyrood has really got under the skin of the First Minister and really ensured that we can get some way towards the truth in terms of so many issues. But, there's not many political leaders who have resigned from government over a point of principle. So I go into this election as someone who will stand up for Scotland when I think it's, in the best interest of the country. That sometimes means going against my party. It means voting against the party. It means standing up to authority. And I think that's the right thing to do. So I've always been someone who goes with my beliefs, very strongly held beliefs, and will see them through. and I think that's what people are looking for in politics, someone who doesn't just nod his head and agree with everything that other people say, someone who can drive his own strategy, his own team, take them forward and really deliver for Scotland. And I think we've got an opportunity to do that.
So obviously the last week has been, you know, the drama, the psychodrama of the Sturgeon-Salmond affair. You called for her to resign, but she's still there. They're still doing well in the polls. She seems pretty untouchable. I mean, if this is not going to bring Nicola Sturgeon down, what will? Well,
so a couple of things. I mean, first of all, this week we called for the Deputy First Minister to face a vote of no confidence because the SNP Scottish Government refused to accept 2 votes in the Scottish Parliament where opposition parties united behind the Scottish Conservatives to release legal advice. And only when John Swinney's job was on the line did they ultimately release some of that legal advice that they'd received in their ill-fated Court of Session case against Alex Salmond that cost Scottish taxpayers more than £500,000. So the reason that we've now got mounting evidence against multiple breaches of the ministerial code by Nicola Sturgeon is because Scottish Conservatives were able to unite the opposition parties to get the Scottish Government to release that. When that evidence was released, at the same time, we also then had further witnesses confirming to the committee that Nicola Sturgeon was aware of the claims against Alex Salmond before she previously said she was, and crucially, that the name of one of the complainers was revealed to Alex Salmond's team. And this was clear evidence, corroboration from witnesses who are, in recent past, have been MSPs for the SNP, Duncan Hamilton, or in Kevin Pringle's case, Communications Director for the SNP. So witnesses who come from the SNP background confirming that Nicola Sturgeon had lied, had misled the Scottish Parliament, and corroborating evidence that the committee had earlier seen. And if you lie to the Scottish Parliament, you cannot continue as First Minister. And that's why I think it was right that Scottish Conservatives said we would lodge a motion of no confidence in the First Minister, and that's what we've done.
So is this affair damaging the SNP brand? Can you see that in public attitudes in Scotland?
Yeah, I think it's damaging the SNP brand because clearly, people don't know who to trust. There's so much lies and deceit clearly at the heart of government. We heard at the committee this week, Nicola Sturgeon couldn't defend why her party and government had blocked so many attempts by this committee to get to the truth. Nicola Sturgeon told us she would make any and all information available, and that's simply not been the case. But more importantly for me, it's damaging Scottish politics. It's damaging the reputation of our parliament. At 22 years old, we still have a very young parliament in Scotland, and people expected far better than this. And I think that's the saddest effect of the last few days, is how it's really dragged down the Scottish Parliament and the reputation of Scottish politics.
Your central argument on this seems to be that honesty really is important in politics. So let's put that to you, which is your honesty about mistakes in the past. Do you look back at things in your political career and say, I made a mistake there, my judgment was wrong? Do you have any of those? Do you have any regrets that you sort of want to share?
Yeah, loads. I mean, almost every week I'm thinking, God, could I have done that differently? Did I listen to this piece of advice? Should I have done that? When I was a minister, you have to make decisions. I was a junior minister in the Scotland office, and you're looking at things and thought, could I have done this better? Was that a mistake? So I don't think any politician should ever say they've never made a mistake. I've said things in speeches that I've gone on to regret. I've answered quick-fire questions that have come back to haunt me. So throughout my political career, there are things I would have done differently. And I'd be pretty disappointed if you asked any politician that if they made mistakes and they said they hadn't.
Can I just push you on that? Is there a specific one where you feel, particularly maybe in your time as an MP, where you feel actually, I thought that was wrong and my views really changed?
Well, I think in terms of, if we go back to the quick fire one that I was mentioning there, I was asked when I was a new MP what would be my number one priority if I was Prime Minister for a day. And there are a multiple of different, better answers I could have given than one that I gave about a local issue here on enforcement against gypsy travellers. And that's something that still comes up. It was on my Twitter feed the other day, and I deeply regret my answer to that question and the way it was interpreted. And I said that at the time. It was a big local issue. It continues to be a big local issue here in Murray every summer. But it's never something I should have answered as being my top priority if I had one day as Prime Minister. But that's just one example. I have said things, I've done things that if I had my time again, I would have gone in a different direction. But we don't have the benefit of hindsight in politics. We have to be open and accept our mistakes and learn from them and move on. And I think politicians who are willing to do that, who are willing to accept they made a mistake, they don't try to bury bad news and paper over the cracks and hope no one notices. Just be upfront and honest with people. And again, my honesty has sometimes got me into trouble as well, both with my party and for myself. But I think people just want honesty from politicians, that you say what you think, but if you've made a mistake, you'll correct it and you won't do it again.
Very much agree. I think that's a really good answer. Thinking now about the mistakes that the UK government has made around COVID, which is obviously still the biggest issue that we're facing. Obviously, the vaccine rollout is brilliant, and the UK is really performing exceptionally compared to other countries. But until this point in the whole crisis, the UK hasn't done particularly well if you look at the data around health outcomes and economic outcomes. And of course, famously, you resigned last year as a government minister because Dominic Cummings did not resign from alleged lockdown breaches. So what, in your mind, are the kind of big lessons that the UK government should learn from some of the failures around COVID?
Well, I think there's a lot for every government, Scottish government, UK government, and governments around the world. I think we have to cut all governments a bit of slack. They were dealing with a virus that no one had heard of 15 months ago, and it was deeply challenging conditions. But, if we look at specific examples, I think the test and trace system didn't work as well as it should have done, particularly in the initial weeks and months when we looked to adopt that here in the country. That was before the vaccine really took off. That was our way to contain the virus and get numbers down. But it simply didn't work as well as it should have done. And I think government ministers would accept that. There's been other areas, we could go into lots of different points where governments could improve. And I think it's absolutely right that we look at the lessons from this pandemic to make sure they never happen again. But we also can't underestimate the challenges that all governments faced. And that's what we've seen right around the world in terms of dealing with a new virus, in terms of putting in measures that no government, whether you're left wing or right wing, would ever expect the public to have had to have heard from their leaders. These are huge restrictions that people have now been living with for the last 12 months. We've also got to look at how we've supported individuals and businesses through this, that there would be better ways to do that if we had our time again. But again, schemes were being developed at such short notice. So yeah, I think if you're asking me to pick one, I think test and trace could have been done a lot better. But there's also been some really good stuff, as you say, the vaccine and the foresight to procure and develop these vaccines right at the beginning of this pandemic has paid dividends. And just look at where we are compared to many other areas in Europe and across the world.
And, you've criticised Nicola Sturgeon for not publishing a roadmap out of the lockdown. So I'm just trying to think, what would Douglas Ross do differently out of this lockdown, both compared to Nicola Sturgeon, but also to Boris Johnson? What would be a kind of unique Douglas Ross departure from lockdown?
Well, the unique one would be how we support businesses. In Scotland, we've got 44 different schemes that businesses have got to try and get their heads around to get the money they need. And there's obviously been almost £10 billion of additional support coming to the Scottish Government, but that's not getting to the businesses who need it. And as I said in my remarks about the budget, we need to get businesses through this final stage of the health emergency and through the next few weeks and months as we start to reopen the economy. And I'm just so frustrated that there is funding there that's not getting to them. I've also, and this isn't unique, which is why I didn't start on it, but we have to do more in Scotland to get young people back to school quicker. It's been a year of such disruption for young people here in Scotland and across the UK. And I think the pace at which Nicola Sturgeon is getting kids back to school is too slow. We can do this safely quicker, and we've already seen a partial U-turn from her on this issue since she outlined the next steps. But I believe there's opportunities to get young people back into education far quicker. I also think we just need a bit of hope and clarity as to how we get through this. And the Scottish Government's route map seems to suggest that the vaccine rollout doesn't change things. Well, over 1.6 million people in Scotland have now had the first dose of the vaccine. That surely changes how we ease the restrictions going forward. And we should set some clear dates to work towards, which we don't have in the Scottish route map.
Do you think it was right to shut the schools in January and February? I mean, a lot of people say, particularly primary school children, the evidence on their impact around transmission is very unclear, and the evidence suggests it's not very strong, actually, their impact on transmission. Why were childcare settings open, but not primary schools?
Well, I think the biggest issue was the point about community transmission, that if the schools are open and people are just moving around generally, taking kids to school, picking them up, etc., that the virus had more of an opportunity to get around. And we knew from the restrictions that were introduced in Scotland, across mainland Scotland from Boxing Day, that the virus we were dealing with at that point was far more transmissible in terms of the risk for greater community transmission. So I understand why that decision was taken. What I don't understand is why the Scottish Government hadn't used the period from the summer until January to really develop further online learning, because it is still patchy right across Scotland and young people have suffered as a result of that. There is no doubt teachers have done an outstanding job. And I say this particularly because I've got a sister who's an English teacher here in Murray. I know what they are doing day in, day out, but I also know the restrictions on what they're trying to do, because online learning has not been developed in the way it should have been since the last lockdown in the summer. When we knew there were issues then, why didn't the Scottish Government, hoping never to need to use online learning again, not develop and invest in that tool while we were out of the restrictions for some time to ensure it was a better system in place if we ever had to revisit them? And sadly we did, and the system was patchy. And that's not just me saying it, it's teachers, it's experts like Professor Lindsay Patterson and others who have been really disappointed at the ability to really improve the online learning system here in Scotland.
I think generally online learning is suboptimal. And considering that, do you think there's a case to shorten the summer holidays, get kids at school for 4 of the 6 weeks in the summer holidays to make sure the learning loss isn't as profound?
But what I've said is I'm not going to rule anything out. I think we've got to, first of all, focus on getting young people back into school here in Scotland as quickly as possible, as quick as it's safe to do so. And we've outlined plans how that can be done by the middle of this month. Again, that's going ahead of what Nicola Sturgeon has suggested. And then we've got to see what we're going to do in terms of catch up once we've got people safely back in and see the environment that they're being taught in. But certainly can't rule anything in or out.
I think in my final part of questions, before we open it up to the audience, who are there, hopefully they're still there, but I know because we're getting questions through. My final part is on the union, and it seems to be very fragile now. The level of support for independence in Scotland, according to the polls, is at historic highs. Number 10, obviously, there's been a lot of changes in personnel in the union unit in number 10. Do you think that gives a kind of indication that there's panic in number 10 and amongst unionists about saving the union, that it's actually now drifting away and it's almost inevitable that Scotland will leave the UK at some point?
Well, I don't think it's inevitable, and I've been saying that ever since I became leader of the Scottish Conservatives and long before that. But I do think we have to look at all the opinion polls, and at some points there's a shift away from independence, and we have seen support falling now in a number of opinion polls, but that doesn't downplay the challenge that we face right now and will continue to face. But it does make me even more determined to win this fight, to ensure that we can focus on Scotland's recovery from this pandemic rather than another divisive independence referendum. And we can do that by stopping the SNP in May. And Scottish Conservatives did it in 2016. We more than doubled our number of MSPs. We're the only party with the strength right across Scotland to take on the SNP. And that's what we'll be doing in the weeks ahead of May the 6th election. But to go to your point about number 10, the UK government and the union unit, there is absolutely a huge focus on supporting the union of the United Kingdom, the family of all four nations, to ensure we remain a strong, United Kingdom. And we've seen through the last 12 months how that has helped every part of the country get through the most difficult of times with this pandemic. And I think it's that strength of togetherness that will take us through the next 12 months and beyond.
So thinking of the kind of strategic approach for saving the union, are you in the camp of let's put the accelerator on more devolution? And Murdo Fraser, for example, has written for Bright Blue about setting up a kind of quasi-federal settlement for the union. Or are you of the view that actually we need to pause a bit on devolution now and really stress UK-wide initiatives, ideas, institutions, policies? So are you press the accelerator on devolution, or are you putting the brake on, even doing a U-turn a bit on devolution?
Well, I'm not putting my foot on the accelerator, pressing the brake, or doing U-turns. What I'm saying is, in terms of Scottish devolution, we have to use the powers we've got in Scotland at the moment to improve the lives of people in Scotland. That's why we've spent a lot of time speaking about education, about speaking about Scotland's economy, how we protect jobs in this country, all things that can be a focus of government and parliament if we get away from the constitutional wrangling. Does the Scottish Parliament need more powers? Well, just look at what the SNP have done when they received powers from Westminster. They asked for more powers over social security, and then they handed them back to Westminster because it was too complex to set up the schemes they had intended here in Scotland. So what I would say, rather than calling for more powers, let's use the powers we have right now to improve the lives of people in Scotland and the communities they live in. And then in terms of the UK government, yes, we should do far more to show the UK government role here in Scotland. I'm very pleased to see the direct investment that's coming from the UK government. It will benefit communities here in Moray and right across Scotland. And the full outrage that we've seen from the SNP that this is undermining devolution is utter rubbish. It is simply showing that Scotland has two governments, both of which can invest in Scotland to improve the lives of the people who live here. And I think that's a very solid message to take to the people of Scotland.
So are you of the view then that broadly the current range of powers Holyrood has is about right? That devolution to this date has been broadly right?
Yes, and what we've seen since the 1997 Act, 1998, when 97 referendum, 1998 Scotland Act, and then subsequent acts in, I think, 2011, 2016, were all responses to individual issues at that time. They were never in themselves responses to independence or growing calls for independence. So it has been right that devolution and the settlement has evolved since the Scottish Parliament was re-established in 1999. But that doesn't mean that the answer is always throwing more powers. As I say, let's look at using the powers we have right now, rather than calling for more powers, seeking to continually find causes of friction and divide between Scottish and UK government. I think what most people want in Scotland right now is a bit of calm, a bit of focus on our recovery, and stop this endless big bickering between Scotland's two governments. They just want them to work together.
What I find hard to get my head around in this argument is, if we're saying that devolution is about right now, how can you square that with the fact that, of course, the SNP have largely been in charge of Scottish government for the 2 decades and a bit that they've had it? How can you say that devolution is just about right, but the SNP have been a disaster? Surely that shows that devolution has been a disaster.
No, it's been the focus of the SNP, which has been on division, constitutional wrangling, and trying to separate Scotland from the rest of the United Kingdom. They have used their position as the government in Scotland not to improve education, not to focus on the NHS, not to try to rebuild our economy, not to protect people's jobs, but to promote their party ambition, which is to separate our country. So I'd far rather the focus was not on that constitutional battle, but on the powers that we've got that can really drive Scotland forward. And particularly in the next Parliament, that's where the focus has to be. As we rebuild after coronavirus, we have to put our focus and every bit of effort into our recovery, not into another referendum.
And finally, from me, you are obviously the figurehead for the Scottish Conservatives, but the Conservative Party brand is led by Boris Johnson. Is Boris a help or a hindrance to you in Scotland in your electoral chances?
Well, I lead the party in Scotland. It's the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party is distinct from the UK party. I'm the leader. I'm standing for election to Holyrood with my colleagues, and it's our manifesto that is agreed in Scotland by me and my team. The Prime Minister is leader of the Conservative Party across the country and Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and he will play a role in this election. But he is not standing for election to Holyrood. I am. It's my team, my policies that will be going forward to the people of Scotland, and I think that's absolutely the right approach for the Scottish Conservatives.
Very clear. Okay, so let's open it up to questions. So if you are still watching, please send in your questions through Slido. My first question has come from Martin Kettle, who is the assistant editor of The Guardian, and he just flags Mark Drakeford's comments about the aggressive unilateralism towards the devolved arrangements from the UK government, which he describes as a kind of outright hostility towards the devolved nations. Do you think that's right? Do you think the UK government are being quite hostile to devolved governments? And as a representative or a wannabe representative of a devolved government, are you concerned about that?
No, I don't agree with Mark Drakeford. I think he made those comments at the Welsh Affairs Select Committee, and it goes back to the point I was making earlier. In Scotland, and I assume it's in the same in Wales, people just expect both their governments to work together. And at times that means in Scotland, additional funding coming from the UK government to the Scottish government to support it during this pandemic. As I said earlier, almost £10 billion in additional support just to fight coronavirus. But at other times, it means directly investing in priorities, that the levelling up funds should be administered by the UK government and other funds should be administered by the Scottish government. And people are more interested in getting investment in their area rather than which government it is that's putting it in, or has one government had more of a say or less of a say. But I also, something that we haven't really mentioned today is, this isn't new, it's not novel. We've seen city and region growth deals now in every part of Scotland, which actually proves that the two governments can work together. They can put in funding from both sides to agree projects with local communities and deliver them. That's a really good model that I think we should celebrate, rather than saying if the UK government were to invest in Scotland, somehow that is undermining devolution or the devolution settlement.
A lot of people are criticising the Levelling Up Fund and the Towns Fund. They think it's showing a bit of bias towards the Conservatives. It's tending to go to areas where Conservatives represent those constituencies. Do you think there is a kind of danger of the way that these funds are designed, that it, to use an American phrase, shows kind of pork barrel politics?
No, I think when you've got an 80 majority in the House of Commons, therefore more of the United Kingdom is represented by Conservatives, therefore by simple maths, that more of the communities that have Conservative representation, because they are the governing party and have a huge majority, will benefit from what the Conservative government are doing.
But just to push you on that, I mean, the Chancellor's constituency is quite affluent, but it's receiving these regeneration funds that a lot of people think, why is that a priority against other areas which seem to be more deprived?
Because all of these projects are assessed and the government have to take these decisions, but we've seen investment right across Scotland and across the United Kingdom. Yes, you can pick examples of where there is funding going to the Chancellor's constituency, but there are also examples of where it's going to Labour constituencies and other constituencies. So this is funding that is levelling up right across the United Kingdom. We are seeing that investment in Scotland. I think it's something to be celebrated, and every area that gets this additional spending is going to see investment in their area, and that's something that we should welcome and celebrate. And and I certainly do, because we're seeing a lot of that coming to Scotland, both with the Levelling Up funding, with the Shared Prosperity Fund. The Union Connectivity Review is going to see more jobs and investment coming to Scotland, and I think it's a disgrace that the SNP withdrew their officials from even discussing that. So this is part of a wider package of this government at a UK level, ensuring that every part of the United Kingdom benefits through Levelling Up and so many other schemes that will see the investment driving into local areas, and that's something I welcome.
So another question we have from James Leeson, who says, what do you think of calls for a new Act of Union to amend the devolution settlement and or a Clarity Act to outline referendum terms and consequences?
Well, I really don't want to have to focus on referendums, terms and consequences, because I want the next Parliament in Holyrood for the next 5 years to be focused on recovery, not on referendums. And I think we can do that by stopping the SNP in May. We really have to focus on the challenges that we face right now and the challenges we're going to face in the medium to long term, both in Scotland and across the UK. And we do that by focusing our political debate and what our politicians are discussing and putting forward on recovery, not on referendums.
So another question that's come through is from Alexander Brown, who asks, in your eight-point plan ahead of the budget, you called for a larger post-Brexit fishing fund. Why did the Chancellor not do this, and where do we go from here?
Well, I'll continue to ask for that, and I think what the Chancellor was looking at was how the £100 million will be spent and the £23 million in compensation will be spent, and we are waiting to see the bids come in for that and how that will be dispersed across the country. So that call from me remains, and I said to you earlier, Ryan, that I don't just ask for things that I know I'm going to get, but I will continue to challenge for it, and I believe coastal communities and fishing communities need our support. The Brexit deal didn't deliver for them in the way they had hoped, and there have been significant problems in terms of bureaucracy and added paperwork that continue to need to be resolved. And until we can do that, then we will need to continue to support them. But I'm pretty sure the Chancellor is looking at how that support is being spent now, and we might have to come back to this. But I will keep challenging and fighting for the fishing communities in the northeast of Scotland and other parts of the country.
So somebody has asked a question anonymously, and they say, is it possible for the Scottish Conservatives to stop using the term independence, which they deem to be an SNP term, and to use the phrase leaving the UK instead? So it seems like semantics, but it could have a substantial impact.
I think there's a point there. I mean, I tend to use the word, and I have already this morning, separating from the rest of the United Kingdom, because independence, the word itself is quite a positive word. When you're younger, you want to become independent and move away from home and start off in life. When you're older, you want to remain independent as long as you can. So I can understand why that word has more positive connotations than separation. But I think whatever we're speaking about, it is about ripping apart the United Kingdom, and that's what the SNP want to do, and I want to stop it.
So we've had a question from George Jones, who asks about COP26 and how you might differentiate yourself from the SNP in terms of the kind of climate offerings from the Scottish Conservatives.
Yeah, well, we've done quite a lot of work already, and I was speaking to CBI earlier on this week just about what we do to ensure the green agenda goes right through our manifesto. We're continuing to develop that up in the next few days and weeks. I think people will see from the Scottish Conservatives when our manifesto comes out a really positive vision for the green agenda in Scotland to get more green jobs into the country and to use COP26, as I say, not just in itself a period for focus on the climate change emergency and what we can do here in Scotland and across the UK, but really a springboard into the next Parliament and what we focus on as politicians and parliamentarians to ensure that we meet our ambitious targets right across the country and we really deliver for the next generation. As going back to what we said, Ryan, earlier about my son, I want to ensure the country and the climate and the world that he grows up in is improved from where it is now, because it is an emergency that we're facing and it's got to have the focus and the resources directed towards that.
Okay, well, there's another question here, which is climate related. So Andrew Lemming has asked, how would the Scottish Tories approach the transition among North Sea firms to a net zero economy?
Well, part of that was the £27 million investment that we heard this week in the budget. It was announced just ahead of the budget. It's been widely welcomed. Again, I have a lot of interaction with Oil and Gas UK and a number of companies involved, and there's a real optimism within the sector that they can work both in terms of what they're doing at the moment with oil and gas and the move towards net zero and the targets we're seeking to achieve as a nation. But I think the current and the long-term ambition is there. There is a period in the middle that we've got to ensure government at Scottish level and UK level continues to invest in the sector as they adapt what they're doing and transition to ensure that highly skilled jobs we've got in the sector, particularly here in the North East, can easily move from oil and gas and into a more greener agenda. And that's a period that I don't think has got the focus as much as it could have done in terms of that transition period. There is a deal on the table that we will continue to work with the sector on to deliver, but the investment this week was just the first step towards that, and I think you'll see more to come in the months and years ahead.
Okay, and the B word hasn't come up, Brexit. So there's a question here from David Wakefield, who says, do you worry about the impacts of Brexit on Scotland and the Union? And David has also said that, COVID has been dominating the press, but actually there's been quite a lot of issues around bureaucracy facing businesses and exporters into the EU. So do you worry that this over time will impact on the Scottish economy and on the support for the Union?
Well, I've said before, there's no doubt there are people who voted no to Scottish independence in 2014, but voted to remain in the European Union in 2016, who are now considering whether they would still support staying as part of the United Kingdom. But I think clearly getting a deal with the EU on Christmas Eve last year was positive for many of these people because they were worried about a no-deal Brexit, and they are or were reassured that a deal could be reached with the EU. I already mentioned in my answer about fishing that I accept for our exporters, there are too many delays still. There has been progress, but it's still an issue. There's too much bureaucracy, and we've got to get to the bottom of that. It is not the fault of the fishermen or the exporters. It is the fault of the government with the Scottish level, because we've had issues at Larkhall with the hub and at a UK level in terms of the bureaucracy that was added in, and we've got to resolve that. It's simply something that we can't avoid. But we've also got to look at where we are now because of Brexit. I mean, our vaccination programme has accelerated throughout the United Kingdom because we were able, as an independent country out with the EU, to procure and source these vaccines at an early stage. That's why we are so far ahead of our neighbours across the EU. And just look at, and I'm sorry to keep going back to whisky, but I was just so delighted by yesterday's announcement on tariffs being removed from whisky and cashmere and many other UK products. These tariffs still apply in the EU, and that just shows exactly what we can do as an independent country. Because Liz Truss took a bold decision back in January to remove the tariffs at our end. That trust has then led to the US reciprocating with this suspension for 4 months, and that's clearly wouldn't be possible if we're still part of the EU, where these tariffs still apply.
So I just want to push you on this Brexit question, because you voted for Remain in the 2016 referendum. So what do you think the downsides are at the moment to leaving the EU?
Well, I call myself a reluctant Remainer back in 2016 because I could see a number of the pitfalls of remaining part of the European Union, but I was concerned about coming out and the added bureaucracy, the added problems that would lead to. And we saw over the prolonged period of our exit from the European Union that these issues intensified, and that's why we are still dealing with the problems, particularly for our exporters. So there, I'm not hiding the challenges that are particularly for exporters, but these are not insurmountable challenges. We can work both within the UK and with partners in Europe who will be facing many of these challenges in just a few months' time as well when their grace period ends. So it's in everyone's best interest to resolve them. They can be resolved and then we can move on. But I don't underestimate the challenges being faced by many companies at the moment, and that's why I'm working with them, trying to stand up for them and get more support in these difficult months.
So there's a question from someone called Mac, who, I don't know if that's first name or second name, just called Mac, could be Alan Mac, who knows, who says, do you agree with your colleague Andrew Berry, MP, who said that this generation, the young generation, will not see the benefits of Brexit?
Well, this generation are already seeing the benefits of Brexit. The 50,000 people employed directly or indirectly in the Scotch whisky industry are celebrating today because they can see these tariffs being suspended. And young people here in Scotland and right across the UK are seeing the benefits of our vaccination programme in the United Kingdom, which isn't being replicated in Europe, and that will see our freedoms being returned far quicker and easing of the restrictions. So I think we're already seeing the benefits of being an independent country out with the EU.
And a question from Joseph Silk, who says, what more can be done to bring down the horrific level of drug deaths in Scotland? Do you agree with rolling out safe rooms?
No, I don't. I've looked at this very closely, both in the Scottish Affairs Select Committee, which I currently serve on, and previously in the Home Affairs Select Committee, where I think we need to focus as much resource as possible is in rehabilitation. And I thought it was shameful that the Scottish Government previously withdrew funding for rehabilitation beds in Scotland, and we got down to an all-time low. And that's why I welcomed the fact that belatedly they did answer Scottish Conservative calls and they put in £20 million investment this year. That's where I want to see the focus. But it is a damning indictment of this SNP government, who have been in power for the last 14 years, that Scotland has the highest drug deaths levels, not just in the United Kingdom, but across Europe and possibly even across the whole world.
I mean, the world does slowly but surely seem to be moving in a direction of decriminalisation. For example, Portugal's decriminalised cannabis, some US states have, Uruguay in South America. Why not get ahead and sort of, it seems to be working in those countries. Why not proceed with that decriminalisation?
Well, I would question if it's working, and I've looked at the evidence, and there's evidence on both sides, but I am not convinced that the way to tackle the problem of drug misuse is to make it easier for people to get drugs.
Final question for me, which is, sometimes people like to depict Scotland as very different to England, much more liberal and progressive in its attitudes. Do you think that? Do you think there is a lot of substantial difference in the kind of underlying values and opinions and cultural kind of values of Scots compared to English people? Or do you actually think there's much more similarity?
I think there's a lot of similarities, but we have our own uniqueness as well. So I think it can be a bit of both. We are obviously, we all speak the same language. We're all part of the United Kingdom, but there are cultural differences. There are historical differences here in Scotland that aren't shared in other parts of the United Kingdom. But overall, I think we are quite closely associated. And just on political views, we see quite often this view that Scotland has somehow got very different views on a variety of issues. But actually, when you poll people on them, the opinions of people in Scotland are actually quite similar to those in other parts of the United Kingdom.
Great. Well, I think we've come to an end, and you've taken a lot of questions. So thank you very much for that. You've really had a grilling both from me and from the audience. So we're very grateful for your time.